Hey everyone, this is Kevin from the chesswebsite.com, and today we're going to be looking at day number 4 from the 2017 Champions Showdown. If you're not familiar with this tournament, there's 8 individuals and they're matched up against one person. They're going to be playing that person for 30 games over a 4-day stretch. Those range from rapid to blitz games, blitz being the faster of the two. And on day 4, which we are at, they play 12 games and they only have 5 minutes on their clock. So they end up playing one individual a lot of chess games. The winner of the heads-up battle will get $60,000. The loser in each of the heads-up battle will get $40,000. Now, for most of the competitors, 6 of them, this is it. This is the final day. For Magnus Carlsen and Ding Lian, they just started yesterday, so they were on day 2 today. So we will have coverage the next 2 days as they play day 3 and 4. But wanted to go over one of the matches from one of the closest heads-up battles, and that's between Wesley So and Leonardo Dominguez. Over the first 3 days, Leonardo Dominguez has a small advantage, 1 game in hand against Wesley So. But day number 4, there's 12 blitz games they will be playing, so anything can happen. Game number 1 went to Wesley So. He had the white pieces, got a victory, which brings us to game number 2. Dominguez trying now with the white pieces, come back, get that victory, and then continue that momentum going on. So we will start with Dominguez with the white pieces. Pawn to d4, knight f6, knight f3, pawn d5, pawn e3, pawn e6, not a system that we see that often. Knight here to d2, pawn b6, bishop here d3, bishop b7, castle on the king side. If you're not too familiar with this system, this is the Kali system, and it's something you usually don't see at the highest level play. It is very sound, and many times you don't even have to worry what your opponent's going to do as black because you're not really putting too much material in the center of the board, so you can usually develop and they really can't stop you. You're not trying to force anything. And so this is a way many times in a blitz game, someone will play this to stop their opponent from being super aggressive, or if there's a prepared line that they've been shoving down your throat for a few games here. This just says, okay, let's come back to just a normal game. For 3 days, I've done extremely well. I've had an advantage. The last game didn't go well in game 1 when Wesley So ran over Dominguez. And so let's just calm down. And that's exactly what he's doing. Now, there's a few variations that you can use in the Kali system. One, and the most common, would be pawn to c3, but we're seeing more and more players when they adopt this to play pawn b3, bishop here to b2, and white's really looking to attack the king side of the board. Black many times, depending on how the pawn structure in the center opens up, he'll a lot of times be looking to attack on the queen side of the board. Wesley So continues castle on the king side, bishop b2, fianchetto on the queen side, pawn c5, starting to attack on the queen side, looking to blow up the middle of the board. Pawn takes, bishop recaptures. I almost think this is good for both sides of the board. Black has both of his bishops eyeing down on the king side, and white, same thing, has both of his bishops eyeing down on the king side. This is opening up the door for black to have a little bit of control in the center of the board. White no longer has a pawn or a piece past the 3rd rank. So white can stay back a little bit, or he can decide to push a little bit forward. First, decides to go ahead and continue his development. After queen e2, he has completed development. Knight to d7, just getting that last piece involved, and then pawn up here to c4, looking to blow up the center of the board. Queen e7 finishes development from black. Pawn to a3 with the queen on the same diagonal as the bishop. Once one, make sure that doesn't have to worry about bishop coming down here to b4. Also just solidifies and controls this b4 square. Pawn e5 says, yeah, I want to attack the center of the board. Anytime your opponent plays a piece anywhere, you always want to look at what was left behind. And this square here on f5, which he was controlling, was left behind. And so immediately we see the bishop come here to f5, attacking this knight on d7. Wesley So says, I'm not too worried about that. I'm going to continue to push pawn here to e4, and then knight over here to d4 in the center of the board. Knight to e5, not looking to give up that knight. Going to try to control the center with knight to e5, and then bishop back here to h3, and then pawn g6. Pawn b4, forcing the bishop to come back. Bishop to d6, knight to b6, attacking the bishop. So both sides, kind of going back and forth. Black has done a good job of attacking the center of the board. He does have a backward pawn here on d5. Black has forced the bishop over here to h3, so no longer threatening the king side of the board, kind of in no man's land right now. And then we see Dominguez starting to push a little bit himself with pawn to c4, and then getting his knight involved, forcing these bishops to come back from his opponent. Bishop comes back here to b8, not really doing as much as it was before, and then pawn recaptures here on d5. Now, after the pawn takes on d5, we'll see Linier Dominguez be looking at bringing his rook over here to c1 as soon as files open up, whether it's a fully open file like this or semi-open file where maybe the white pawn is gone but the black pawn is still there. You're going to want to swing your rooks over there to control that file. Make sure that no piece gets there that you can't take advantage of. Bishop takes on d5 and then bishop up here to d4. And this is an interesting move because a lot can go wrong in this type of position. The bishops come down. It looks like it's just taking back that material. You exchange pawns. Okay, bishop takes. You could have taken with his knight. He decides to take it with his bishop. Doesn't seem too crazy. Many players would play rook to c1, but this is actually a pretty big mistake here. From here, you would see knight to d3, attacking both the rook and the bishop. Well, you're not going to be losing your rook here. That would be a mistake. So if you play rook to b1, knight takes, rook recaptures, but then queen to e5 is the deadly move. This threatens mate here on h2, and you're going to end up losing this rook here on b2. Now, it's subtle because bishop to d4 makes a lot of sense. But many people would just look at this and say, yeah, the C file's open. I'm going to go ahead and play rook over here to C1. And in a blitz game, it's very tough to see. You just don't have a lot of time to think. So props to Dominguez for making sure that he didn't play the more obvious move, and that's rook here to C1. He first decided to get his bishop out of harm's way and plays bishop to D4 first. Knight comes back to C6, attacking the bishop. Rook here to c1. Now it doesn't matter anymore. The knight can't come to d3, and that threat is no longer there. We do see an exchange on board. Knight recaptures on d4, and then bishop down e5. So all in all, Wesley So has done pretty good here. He controls the center of the board. He has a bishop pair, and when you look at pieces, you always want to see how much they're giving to the game. If you have a rook here on a8, it's not really controlling the game too much. This rook on c1 is doing much more. It's controlling this f-file. Bishop, same thing. They want to be in an open game where there's not a lot of pawns blocking their movement. They also want to be in the center of the board where they can control most of the board. These two bishops in the center really giving Wesley So a huge attack anywhere he wants to. He can get his rooks involved, going to have a strong attack from here. From White's perspective, Dominguez needs to get his light square bishop really involved and then start to take advantage of these two knights. While knights tend to do better on one side of the board, there's not much going on the queen side. So if he can really get both of his knights and start attack king side, he could have something very beneficial start to happen for White. He decides to go ahead and attack the center of the board, knight to c4, and Black has kind of a couple options. He could hold on to his bishop pair, but he's going to have to concede the center of the board, or he could decide to give up the bishop pair in exchange for still holding down the center. He decides to hold down the center. Pawn recaptures here on a d4, and immediately the rook comes over here to d8. So there's an isolated pawn here on d4. Wesley So has a better pawn structure getting into the endgame and says, hey, this was a great exchange. I'll give up my bishop pair so that I can start to attack this pawn on d4. Dominguez continues with knight to e5, bishop back to b7, queen e3, knight d5 attacking the queen, queen g3, queen d6. If he was feeling frisky, maybe pawn to f6 forcing the knight to move and then continue, but decides, I'm not going to worry about that too much. Queen d6, queen h4, pawn f6, now forcing the knight to move. Knight c4. Queen down here says, I'll exchange if you want to. Usually not going to see the queen take. Knight recaptures. Just puts a lot of pressure on his opponent with the knight attacking the bishop right here. Then he can always play knight down here to e2, check, forking the rook on c1. White just doesn't have to worry about that. And then as soon as the bishop moves, the pawn right here is going to fall on d4. So that's not going to be the exchange that he wants. So we don't see that. Instead, bishop to e6, king to g7, since it is check, queen h3, supporting this bishop here on e6, and then knight to e7. Not really sure that he had to play knight to e7. Seems somewhat passive for me. Could have had the knight stay in the center of the board, play rook f to e8. This looks fine to me, keeps the center of the board, but he decided it was safer. You don't have a lot of time to think, so knight to e7. What this does do is it opens up the door for a discovered attack, rook to d4, and while if they're playing a longer game, a few hours on board, I don't even know that he would play something like knight to e7, but you could look at this and make an argument that even though technically this is not as strong a move, it just adds more pressure on his opponent to make sure that he's seeing all of these discovered attacks and these critical lines. If he doesn't, yeah, it ends up being a much better move, and that's what happens. The knight comes back here to e3, and knight to e3 is not the best move. He needs to be protecting this pawn on d4 after the discovered attack. He could do it a few ways. He could play queen to e3, holding down the fort. He could play pawn to g3, forcing the queen to come back. Queen b8 after this, and then rook f1 to d1, protecting the pawn. Both of those are fine. What's not fine in my perspective is knight to e3, because then just rook to d4 and you get a free pawn, and you now control the center of the board. Bishop to a2 from here. From Dominguez, bishop to c8, just attacking the queen. Bishop comes back to e6. Bishop b7, never wants to draw here and have repeating moves. Rook to e1, so it says, okay, let's go ahead and get my other rook involved into the game. Hasn't been doing too much at all, so good to see him finally get that involved. Rook f8 to d8, double barreling these rooks here on the d file, and then rook to f1. Super weak sauce move, in my opinion, to bring your rook over here to e1 and then bring it back to f1 when so much is going on in the center of the board. Black continues to add pressure on his opponent, and you're just going to waste a couple moves to bring your rook back here to f1. This to me says white is just hunkering down, trying to find a good move here, doesn't have a lot of time on the clock, and thinks that his pieces aren't really coordinated and doesn't want to make a big mistake, so he's going to try to hold on, see if his opponent can make a big mistake here. Pawn to h5, Wesley, so he feels it. He thinks there's some weakness going on, so he wants to push as much as possible. Pawn to g3. Queen back to e5, wants to make sure that he holds on to his material. Bishop a2, bishop c8, queen down here to g2, bishop g4, wants to get it all on the king side of the board as much as possible. Knight takes, and the pawn recaptures, and this opens up a lot of things. The rook can come over here to h8. Also, if you look at the minor pieces, bishops do really well when there's two pawn structures and things are happening on both sides of the board. And if the queens and the rooks were not on the board, I would say this light square bishop is probably the better minor piece because he can control both. But right now, because there's so much major material with the rooks and the queens, all the action is going to be on one side of the board and one side only. That's the king side. Knights tend to do very well on one side of the board. So Wesley So, although he has a pawn advantage, I think he also has the minor piece as well as just the active pieces as well. So has a huge advantage in my perspective looking at the board state. Now, Dominguez is in a tough spot. This queen is blocked off. He's not going to be doing anything. This bishop over here on a2 is not controlling much of the board. These rooks on the first rank are really not connected except controlling the first rank here. So a rook here, e1. Sure, not doing too much. It does open up the door for the queen to come to f1, but Wesley So is going to continue and get all of his pieces attacking on the king side. So knight to f5, bishop here, b1 has to get over to the king side. Rook e8, just loading up on the square here on e4. Rook to c2 is very odd. Yes, you want to double barrel with your rook here on e2, but it is blocking. Just don't really feel like it's the best option in this position. Maybe queen to f1 and just not worry about getting your rook double bearing here. But besides, rook here to c2, queen to d6, and then rook to e2. And it's almost like he knew that his opponent wanted to play rook d2. Why else would he block his own bishop? And so he played the perfect move that says, hey, if you want to do that, I'm going to play the defense to that, and that is queen up here to d6, rook down to d1. Dominguez didn't have a lot of time to even think about, okay, what is he doing in contrast to what I'm doing. Rook down to d1. We see the bishop take the pawn on e4, and then knight to d4 attacking the rook. And after rook to e3, we have, in my opinion, the favorite move of the tournament, and that is knight to f3. Great decoy, and this is high-level chess that you don't see all that often. Many times players they'll resign way before this point, but in a blitz, anything can happen, and so you see some crazy moves. But to come to this point is always nice. The bishop takes, and then rook to e1 capture. In this particular spot, we did see a resignation. If you're curious how it may continue, if you were to take with his rook, then rook down here, e1, queen comes down here, rook recaptures, and then pawn takes the bishop. You can see how this is going to be an easy game. If for some reason the queen came down here to f1 to stop that, the rook can take that. Rook can come down, take the rook right here. If you want to take the pawn, or if the pawn wanted to take the rook, it could do that. Either way, it's going to end up extremely poorly for white. Has the queen involved, can start gobbling up material, push the pawns on the queen side of the board. There's just not much that Dominguez can do in this position. So Wesley So takes the first two games on day number 4. Just to give you a recap of the 6 competitors through day 4, so you know who won the prizes for those. Wesley So dominated in day 4 against Dominguez. So coming in, Dominguez had an edge and had done extremely well for 3 days, but the blitz portion with 5-minute time control was too much. Wesley So could not be stopped, and he ended up with a small victory. So congratulations to Wesley So. Nakamura playing Topalov. Nakamura destroyed for 4 straight days, Topalov, and so he wins that one. And then we have Alexander Grishuk and Fabiano Caruana, and Caruana ended up winning. And Caruana, similar to Wesley So, he was losing coming into day number 4. He even lost all 3 days, not doing too well at all. But Fabiano Caruana, one of the best blitz players in the world, just dominated Grishuk on day 4. And so he walks away with $60,000. So those are the 6 competitors that are done. For the next 2 days, we have Magnus Carlsen and Ding Lian. We will be covering some of their highlights over the next 2 days. But hopefully you guys are enjoying the Champions Showdown. Some different variations of chess that we just haven't seen too often, so it's always fun to cover that. But thanks for watching. I will see you guys in the next video with Magnus Carlsen.